is a joint collaboration of not only our institute but also International House, to which I would like to extend a very special thanks because they have been really wonderful in making this wonderful facility available and offering us support. And in particular, I would like to thank Director Martin Brennan and Program Director Liliane Koziol, and the Center for Buddhist Studies here at the University of California, Berkeley. And I'll turn the floor over to a representative of the Center for Buddhist Studies in just a moment. I'd also like to say that the overall program, Mongolian Harmony, is a Stanford and Berkeley collaboration, and very particularly between Jin Dong Kai from Stanford University, who will be speaking tonight at the opening of the concert, and Orna Tsultem, who is a graduate of our own History of Art department. They planned the symposium that you're going to hear today, and they were also instrumental in organizing the entire program here and the one to follow in the next coming days at Stanford University. With that, I would like to turn the floor over to the Vice Chair of the Center for Buddhist Studies to say a few words.
Anyway, my name is Sanjot Mahendale. I'm the Vice Chair for the Center for Buddhist Studies. And I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Center on a very, very blustery day, it turns out, in Berkeley, to today's event on Mongolia. If I'm honest, I would have to say that Mongolia is the one area historically not well represented on campus among our community. So I'm very excited about this event today in general, but in particular because the first panel is on Buddhism in Mongolia. And I very much hope that this event will lead to an expansion of activities on the region. There are a number of individuals on campus who have worked very, very hard to get this off the ground. Orna Tsultem was already mentioned. She is and was very, very instrumental in many of the events that were organized dealing with Mongolia. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce the chair of the first panel, Professor Jacob Dalton. Professor Dalton holds a joint appointment in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures and the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies. He's also one of the driving forces behind the Center for Buddhist Studies. And so we owe a lot of our success to his energy. Jacob Dalton received his PhD from the University of Michigan. Initially, he was affiliated with the International Dunhuang Project at the British Library. He also taught at Yale University from 2005 to 2008. His area of specialization is Tibetan Buddhism, in particular Nyingma religious history and tantric rituals. He co-wrote a work on Tibetan tantric manuscripts from Dunhuang. He recently completed a work on violence and the formation of Tibetan Buddhism entitled Taming of the Demons, Violence and Liberation in Tibetan Buddhism. Please help me welcome Professor Jacob Dalton.
Thank you, everyone. It's welcome, and it's a great pleasure to have an event relating to Mongolia here. It's my simple job to introduce our speakers today. So our first speaker is Venerable Damchaabazar, who was born in 1968 in Mongolia. He's been a Buddhist monk since 1990, when he was actually ordained by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. He studied at Sarajay Monastery in India, in South India, for 16 years, and has nearly finished his Geshe degree. During his time in India, he also attended many of public teachings given by His Holiness the Dalai Lama on a variety of subjects in both Dharamsala and in South India. He's now teaching at Lions Roar Dharma Center in Sacramento. So with that.
오늘은 이후 Mongolia соёл урлаг шашны сэдвүүд эдэмшний багвал болон Mongolia соёлын үүдүүдийг зохион байгуулж байгаа Berkeley-ийн сургууль, Stanford-ийн сургуулийн эдэмшин багш нар түүний дотор одоо Монгол судлаач нар өнөөдрийн энэхүү соёлын үүдэлд оролцохоор ирсэн их Монгол орноос нь урьдын ирсэн урлагийн зүтгэлтэн соёлын одоо зохиолч ажилч нар үүнд оролцохоор ирсэн сонирхол та бүхэн шинэ сэтгэлээс баярлалаа.
I would like to greet everyone today, and I would like to express my gratitude to UC Berkeley and Stanford University who are organizing this event of Mongolian culture and art. I would also like to express gratitude and greetings to those participants who came from Mongolia, those important, prominent cultural workers, poets, and musicians from Mongolia. And I would also like to extend greetings to people who come to participate in this event from local areas. Thank you and welcome.
За тэгээд өнөөдрийн Монголын соёл урлаг шашны сэдвт эдэмшлийн хурлын дээр миний тавих энэхүү ихтгэл маань Монгол их Монгол орны бүхэн шашин дэлгэрсэн түүх болон Buddhism орсон хууль нэмэр сэдвтэй бэлтгэл явуулмаар.
So today my talk will be about history of Mongolian Buddhism and contribution of Mongolian practitioners in practice of Buddhism.
За эдгүүгээс 2500 гаруй жилийн өмнө Бурхан багш вэ миний сургаал болон миний шашин умраас умруу дэлгэрийн түүнийг айлцсан байлаа. Ийм бүр түүний айлцнаар дундад Афганистан, Пакистан, Индия, Wallace, Төв, Монгол, Япон, Солонгос зэрэг орнуудад бүхэн хэлсэн билээ.
2,500 years before Common Era, this Buddhism religion started to gain its origins, and from there it spread to Afghanistan, to Central Asia, and to East Asia.
За бүхэн шашны гол урсгал болох их хөлбөмбөгийн сургаал номнод эрхэм соёлын өв сан хадгалан хөгжүүлж ирсэн орн бол Төвд Монгол хоёр юм аа.
And among those places who reserved and preserved through centuries the Dharma is Tibet and Mongolia.
Монгол орны бүхэн шашин үүсэж хөгжсөн түүхэн зохиолуудыг сүм хам ишвэлж, заваадандан авч, дарамдаа, цэмбэр бүс зэрэг эрдэвтэн мэрэгдүүд төвд хэлээр төөрөж байсан юм аа. Заваадандан авчийн их сурвалж бичгүүдээс үүдэн Монгол орны бүхэн шашныг түүхэн хөгжлийг 3 үед хуваад юм аа. Нэгдүгээр төрөв үеийн дэлгэрт, дунд үеийн дэлгэрт, шинэ үеийн дэлгэрт гэж 3 байна.
So among those the history of Mongolian Buddhism in Mongolia was recorded in the works of several Mongolian scholars, such as Sumhamba Ishvarjir, Zawadanding, Dharamdala, Timberbush. And according to the early 20th century text by Zawadanding, history of Mongolian Buddhism is divided into chronologically to 3 periods.
За түрүү үеийн дэлгэрэлтэд монголчууд өв дээдсийн дунд бурхны шашин хүнүү гүрнээс гидан гүрэн хүртэл хөгжлийн үед энтгийн эрдэнэ Ли Фотон аймгаас Гямлан нурууг дамжин их Монгол орноо бурхны шашин дэлгэрсэн анхны үе байлаа.
The beginnings of Buddhism in Mongolia is recorded by in the book Golden Book of Zawadanding during the time of Shunu state, and followed by Khitan state in Mongolia. Buddhism came to Mongolia through India via Li Hotang area through Himalayan region and began its prosperity in Mongolian land.
За түүгээр үл орон Хятад төвдөд бурхан шашин дэлгэрхээс өмнө Монгол орнд бурхан шашин дэлгэрсэн түүх баримтуудыг дурдваас орхон голын хөвөөнд анх бурхан багшийн хөрөг дургийг залан сүм хийд байгуулсан одоогийн Эрдэнэ зүгтийн суурийг тавьсан байна.
So the beginnings of Mongolian Buddhism precedes Buddhist practice in China and in Tibet. And the remnants of early practice of Buddhism in Mongolia are found in Orkhon Valley, in the shrines upon which the current Dalton monastery was built.
За түүгээр болон энтхийн шашин соёл түүнчлэн Panchaabazar-ийн үлгэр туусууд Монгол ард түмний дундах шиг ард түмний дунд туйлс үлгэр туусууд нь ард түмний дунд хэлэгдсэн байдаг. Тэр цагт монголчууд хурд ном уншихдаа санскритаар хурд ном уншиж илтгэл тавьдаг байсан байна.
In this early period of Mongolian Buddhism, the texts and the practice was happening in Sanskrit. The early terminology is passed down to us in Sanskrit, and all the practice, the texts were also used in Sanskrit language.
За санскрит хэлний үг хэллэг нь одоо болтол монголчууд бидний ард түмний дунд хэрэглэцээр байгаа юм. Түүгээр болон саяын төрүүд дэлгэрэлтийн үеийн түүхэн баримтууд буюу анх монгол шашин дэлгэрсэн түүхийн талаар түрүү үеийн дэлгэрэлтэй бий.
So this terminology of Buddhist concepts still passed down to us and are still used in Sanskrit language. And this is a brief, very concise introduction to the first beginnings of Buddhist practice in Mongolia.
За дунд үеийн дэлгэрэлт нь 13-аас 15 дугаар зууны үед хамаардаг. Энэ нь яг үгээр Монголын эзэн төрний их хаадуудын үе буюу Чингис хаанаас эхлэн одоо их хэсэг байдаг. Энэ төрд яг Монгол шашин төр маш их хүчрхэг байсан. Чингис хаан маань яг үгээр ямар ч төр шашныг бол хахаж хавчдгүйгээр маш их онцлогтой байсан. Түүгээр Монгол орнд муслим, манчаас, бөө одоо бүхний шашин зэрэг шашин бол оршиж байсан.
So the middle period of Buddhist practice in Mongolia is Middle Ages, from 13 to 15 centuries. And this time is Mongol imperial period when Genghis Khan, the founder of the empire, was very tolerant to religious practices. So various religions such as Muslim, Christianity, and Buddhism and shamanism were all practiced within the Mongolia.
За нөгөө ховлын цэцэн хааны урилгаар төвдийн одоо Сажава ёсны урсгал Монгол анх орж ирж түүгээрээ яг үхээр шашин төр хосолсон анхны суурийг тавьж байсан. Түүгээрээ яг төвдийн одоо анхны урсгал Монголд орж ирсэн.
And during this time, upon the invitation of Kublai Khan, the Sakya presence happened in Mongolia. Sakya Lama came to Mongol court, and within that, the alliance of government and the religious practice were combined as a dual rulership.
За тэр үед яг үгээр монголчуудын дунд сүм хийж чинээр барьж байсан, ном орчуулж байсан. За төр шашныг хосолсон гол онцлог ном юм бол монголчуудын дунд их одоо хэрэглэгдсэн эрдний сан Субашид гэдэг ном. Одоо тэр үед одоо Монгол шашин төр хоёрыг одоо жинхэнэ барилдуулсан юм уу, ард түмний сургаал болсон хэрэглэгдсэн зохиол одоо тож жишээ байна.
So one of those evidences of practice of the time is Subashid, the text that reflects the dual governance, the governance that combines the spiritual practice and the political alliance.
За энэ нь дунд үеийн дэлгэрэлт. За шинэ үеийн дэлгэрэлт гэдэг маань яг 16-аас 20 дугаар зууны үед Монголын уран шашин тэр чигээр одоо шинжилт хийгдсэн үе байна. Энэ үед яг үгээр одоо Монголын алтан хаан төвдийн шашны тэргүүн сонон жамцыг одоо Монгол дурснараа Монгол бог зонховын шашин буюу гэлөөбийн шашин одоо анх дэлгэрсэн.
The final stage of development of Buddhist practice in Mongolia is late medieval period from 16th to 20th century, and third Dalai Lama was invited by Altan Khan of Tumit, and he was and that was beginning of Gelug presence in Mongolia. Bogzangkawa founded Gelug practice.
За түүгээр яг гэхээр Монголын шашны тэргүүнийг өндөр гэгийн Занабазараар тодруулан томилж Монголын одоо уран шашны шинэ өөрчлөлтийг хийж 1654 онд одоо анх их хүрээ хийдгийг зогслон байсан.
And the highlight of this period is transmission of the religious power and mission of governance to Zanabazar, and building of his monastery Ihue in 1654.
Эгснэр Монгол орны газар нутаг ахуй анд цагаагаар хөрсөн чиг тааруулсан сүнхий ном уншлаг нам нарын хувцас өмсгөл соёл урлагийн шинжилтэнд жинхэнэ өөрчилж одоо өдий болтол тэр уламжлал гэж байна.
So this period is recognized as a renaissance of Buddhism in Mongolia, and there were a lot of changes happening in the practices as well as monastic equipment, changing of monastic robes, material culture, and also an everyday practice that was more flexible towards the climate and the nomadic ways of life of Mongolia.
За тэр тусмаа яг үгээр өндөр гигэн цаанаа уралхан ухааны бүхэл төрлүүдийг Монгол бүсэн дээр буулган амжуулж тэрээр монголчуудын ард түмний шүтэн болсон очир дээр буюу бурхан багшийн гүрийг бүтээж үлдээсэн юм аа.
And one of the reasons of this big wave of changes during this time was because Zanabazar himself was an eminent sculptor and an eminent artist who, by his own hands, accomplished the statue of Vajradhara and Buddha Shakyamuni.
За Zanabazar гигэм Монголын бүхэн шишнийг өөрчлснөөр үл барам дорон дахины бол Монголын одоо соёл урлаг түүний шашныг
Not only did he change the practice in Mongolian Buddhism, bringing a lot of renovations, but also he brought Mongolian culture, Buddhist culture, to the international acclaim.
자, 몽골인 어떤 эртний сүм хийдүүд нь бол сургалтууд нь яг үгээр одоо энтгийн хамгийн эртний одоо налан дарын хийдийн сургалт түүний зохион байгуулалт түүний одоо яг одоо зохион байгуулалт тэр юугаар бол Монголын өөрийнх нь орон нутаг ахуй амьдрал Монгол хүний сэтгүүгээр тааруулсан сүм хийдийг анх тогтсон бүрдүүл бий болсон.
And also this is time of construction of Buddhist temples and Buddhist monasteries that would bring a harmonious living with nomadic lifestyle and being very flexible also with the harsh climate of Mongolia.
За тэр тусмаа яг үгээр одоо бурхан багшийн сургаал буюу их таван ухаан, баг таван ухааныг Монголын нөхцөлд тойруулсан сүм хийдүүд нь өөрийн гэсэн эрэм дараалтай одоо сүм хийдүүдийн олон жил суралцдаг сургалтын програм одоо болтол явагдаж байна.
And the curriculum of monastic education that was founded at that time is still passed on to us, and we still adhere to that, which is happens on the division of the monastic education according to levels, and according to Dharma, and according to ranks also.
자, наланда гэдэг маань яг үгээр оюун ухааныг өгөх гэсэн одоо утгатай үг. Тэр хийдэд яг үгээр эртний одоо философийн үндэслэгч одоо их төв үзэлтэн нагарчуна багш маань одоо тэр сурж байсан, багшилж байсан, тэр хийдийн хам болж байсан түүхтэй тэр түүхэн уламжил Монголд ирсэн юм.
And that curriculum was founded on the practice of Nalanda Monastery of India, and the Nalanda has particular importance to Mongolia as Nagarjuna was a capital of Nalanda Monastery.
За ингэснээр яг үгээр сүм хийдүүдийн дунд яг үгээр монголчуудын дунд хүн ухаан, зурхай, эмнэлэг, намирмын бясалгал, дуун ухаан, зохис таялгуу чиглэлээр тустай хийдүүд нь сурч явагдаж байлаа.
And the temples and monasteries began to specialize in particular sciences, such as meditational practices or sound practices, tantric practices, and so on and so forth.
За ингэснээр яг үгээр 19-р зууны 20-р зууны хэд яг Монголын сүм хийдүүд эрдэмтэн мэрэгдүүдийг бэлтгэн гаргах, эрдэм оюун ухааны ундраг болсон боловсрол шашин шүлийн төв болж чаджээ.
And at the time, Mongolian what it shows is that at the time Mongolian monasteries and temples were able to educate their own monks and their own teachers, and that was very important foundation for Mongolian monastic education.
자, энэ хүү заваа дамдан 감지의 어떤 хорч хонжин зохиолыг 8 дугаар богд хатах зүвсэн дам богд маань анх Занабазар заваа дамдан гавчид одоо айлтгсан байгаа. Тэрний дагуу заваа дамдан гавч маань урд түүхэн ишлүүдийн бүгдийг баримталж аваад энэ Монголын шашин эх орны Монголын бурхан шашин дэлгэрсэн түүхийг 3 үед ингэж хуваасныг би одоо товч хамгийн товчоор нь таанад танилцуулна.
This very brief introduction to sort of chronological history of Mongolian Buddhism was recorded in the text of Zavadanding, who himself recorded upon the order. So this is a brief introduction that I prepared for your attention today, and I would like to conclude with my hope and wish that all these teachings and Mongolian contributions to Buddhist practice will be spread in 10 different directions.
Our next speaker is Matthew King. Matthew is a third-year PhD candidate in the Department and Center for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on scholarly practice, intertextuality, and negotiations of difference on the Tibet-Mongol cultural interface. His dissertation will examine these issues in relation to the early modern Mongol adoption and adaptation of Tibetan Buddhist historiography. So, welcome, Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess it's appropriate I'm following Venerable Damchaabazar Gurjav because I had prepared a paper today also looking a little bit at Dalton. He provided such a wonderful introduction and summary of Dalton's works. I guess this will become just a little footnote to his presentation. I'll try to skip over a couple of things that he already mentioned. Okay, so as Professor Dalton said, I'm interested in the Tibet-Mongol interface and negotiations that Mongols made as they localized the Tibetan tradition, particularly in what we might loosely call the early modern period. Understanding the role that Mongolian Buddhists have played in Tibetan religion and conversely the ways that Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism have informed Mongolian religious, political, and cultural identity is a very complex and challenging topic. There are the practical and theoretical problems of clearly circumscribing what exactly constitutes Mongolian Buddhist religious output in the first place. The issue, of course, is that Mongolian Buddhists were engaged in dynamic cycles of cultural circulation during this period. Circulations of Buddhist literature, of artistic forms, ritual cycles, institutional structures, even persons. That this participation produced a Buddhist culture deeply connected with Tibetan visual and literary forms and typologies, perhaps explain the frequent implicit scholarly characterizations of Mongolia's Buddhist culture as being somewhat static, degenerate, and derivative. It certainly explains why, as Johann Elberskog has written, the study of Buddhism in Mongolia has today often been marginalized vis-a-vis Tibetan and Tibetan studies. However, contrary to this outdated view, it is becoming clear just how much agency and innovation was involved on the part of Mongolian Buddhists to, on the one hand, conservatively maintain a picture of uncorrupted Buddhist transmission from Tibet and India before that, while on the other hand, creatively localizing that tradition within the diverse cultural and political contexts of early modern Mongolia. I believe that a fertile approach to the study of the Mongol reception and adoption of Tibetan religious forms is to try and isolate the localizing procedures and practices themselves. In my dissertation research, as Professor Dalton said, I'm trying to look at the Mongol adoption, or perhaps we could say co-option, of Tibetan historiographic conventions, Chojung, Logu, Gyalrab, and how the unique story of Mongolian Buddhism came to be articulated by Mongol historians writing within the rigid conventions of Tibetan historiography in the Tibetan language, using the well-known stories of Tibetan religious history as fodder to produce their own unique story. In order to introduce this topic today, I would like to turn to telling just a few examples from the historical works of Zaladamdam, which the Venerable Lama has already said. In these histories of Mongolian Buddhism, just as in earlier Mongolian histories by Tsenpel Dharmatala, Tsupo Khenpo, and so on, Zhao Damdin couched Mongolian history into Tibetan sources and critically read out Mongolian religious identity from those same sources, oftentimes using the editor's knife as much as the author's pen. That he did so by omission as much as inclusion, by selective highlighting as much as narrativization, and by reversal as much as continuity indicates just how fluid our approaches to the circulation of Buddhist culture through Eurasia during this period must be. Those Zhao Damdin assembled several monastic chronicles and biographical works. His two most famous historical pieces are certainly the shorter, versified, melodious-sounding of the auspicious Dharma Conch and the larger 450-folio Golden Annals, which we've heard about already today. This latter text, written in 1919, has been cited as being the final full-length Mongolian Buddhist history produced prior to the Socialist period. In these historical works, as had become common in Mongolian historiography by this time, Zhao Damdin periodized Mongol conversion to Buddhism into three distinct disseminations, which we've already heard, so I'll skip over that. But for the purposes of this panel, I will pay attention only to his appropriation of Tibetan materials in his formulation of these three periods. But I should say that elsewhere, Zhao Damdin's histories creatively engaged with Mongolian materials, Borjigin clan histories, Uyghur Buddhist steles, Chinese records, and even, at times, the work of Russian archaeologists and French museum curators. In general, these all create a distinct spatial and temporal manifestation of Buddha Dharma in Mongol lands in a layered relationship with Tibet, and as part of a larger process of circulation. As Zhao Damdin himself says, quote, "The story of the establishment of Buddhism in Mongol lands, which is the ornament of the center of a maiden's throat blossoming forth like a matchless, auspicious Dharma conch, is comprised of legends which have become scattered like a series of waves. Gathering these renowned histories is like gathering the highest foam from the bubbles in the river of sutra and mantra." So I'm interested in precisely the details of how he gathered the foam from these scattered sources, or in other words, the critical and creative reading which he employed as a way of localizing Mongolian Buddhist identity. Fundamentally, Zhao Damdin's fluid and expansive view of Buddhist history and agency in Mongolian land hinges upon a very particular reading of the manifold references to Hor and ethno-regional markers in Tibetan sources. As the fluid and perennial other of historic, epic, and ritual literature in the Tibetan language, the lands and people of Hor are often referred to Central Asia, in many cases explicitly or implicitly denoting Muslim and or barbarian peoples and regions. Eventually, Horyu and Sogyu became generalized markers, though not consistent markers, for the diversity of Mongolian peoples in the works of Mongolian Buddhists themselves. This fluidity of signification determined where and how Mongolian historians, such as Zhao Damdin, could encounter their own past in Tibetan literature in the early modern period. As for the presence of Hor and Sok peoples in this literature, Zhao Damdin disputes claims made by the Tibetan historian Pao Supa Chenghua in 1545, where he said that you cannot find the land of Hor, or in Zhao Damdin's reading, the land of Mongolia, in Dharma texts. Zhao Damdin counters this by saying, quote, "If they are looking through the canons and commentaries contained in the libraries of great countries, both scholars and the student can clearly see that Hor has existed as a country for tens of thousands of years." Apparently Zhao Damdin was himself up for this recovery operation, carefully cataloging dozens of references to what he interpreted as Mongolian lands and Mongolian peoples from across an astonishing breadth of foreign sources available to him in Tibetan. To his eyes, the Abhidharma, Kalachakra, Sutras, Tantras, various prophetic texts, Tibetan epics, and so forth were replete with references to the history of an expansive Hor and So, or Mongol community with a shared Buddhist past. What is noteworthy here is not only that he could include such a variety of Asian historical literature in his grand story of not only Mongol Buddhism, but Hava Buddhism, Central Mongolian Buddhism. Rather is that for him, these diverse Hor and So places and peoples, which could include at times, as we've heard, even Kashmiri people, Sogdian people, North Indians, and so on, they shared a meaningful religious and cultural identity with his own Haha environs in the early 20th century. So out of many examples, I just wanted to talk about two salient features in Zhao Damdin's presentation of Mongol Buddhist history And one of these is the deep time of Hor, and so Buddhist history, something we've already heard a little bit about. I'll skip over some of that. And the second is what I find especially interesting is the Mongol, the notion that Mongols themselves not only had a Buddhist history that predates that of Tibet and China, but the Mongol actors themselves were implicit agents and catalysts in the Buddhist conversion out of Tibet and China. So as for the first of these, the deep time of a Mongol Buddhist past, he sees a direct connection between the first 6th to the 6th century Buddhist kingdom of Liu or Khotan, as we've heard, and Mongolia. And I forgot to hit the first slide. There's Aladonta there. Maybe I'll just leave that up because my slides are sort of just incidental anyways. As he says while summarizing a larger series of arguments about the connection between Liu and the Mongolia that he inhabited, quote, Zawadamden says, quote, some Tibetan and Mongolian scholars claim that all of Horyul is recognized as Liu. Liu is mentioned in the Kala Chakra as one of the 6 countries, so Hor is part of Liu, end quote. By extensively referencing the histories and prophetic literature related to Liu or Khotan available to him in the Tibetan language, Zawadamden creates a continuity of Mongolian Buddhist culture which actually reaches back well beyond the historical Khotanese Buddhist state into sort of pre-time cosmology and so on. The explicit and implicit consequence of extensively referencing the Buddhist kingdom of Liu is that the contemporary Halha socio-religious tradition of Zawadamden is authorized and legitimized using sources outside of and before China and Tibet. Concluding a long and detailed examination of various sources, he says, quote, as it has been mentioned in these texts, it is clear that Buddhism was established in Hor before Great China and Tibet, as we've heard. The reason for this assertion is that the 5th Chinese king of Hamakuru named Hudi was fighting in Hor. Amongst the bounty taken from Hor, they found a huge golden statue of Buddha. People say that this was the first holy object of the Chinese, and so by consequence, Buddhism in Hor, Mongolia, must predate that of China. Zawadamden also references the journeys of the Chinese pilgrims Faxian and Xuanzang to India in the 4th and 7th centuries. After providing rich details of their journeys through flourishing Hor and Sok Buddhist kingdoms before and during the first Tibetan contact with Buddhism, Zawadamden seems satisfied to assert that, quote, if you look at Hor in these Chinese stories, there is no doubt that Buddhism established itself in Hor before China and Tibet. So within the context of this deep time, the hyper-attention of Mongolian historians to instances of Hor and Sok actors and places in Tibetan historical records also produced fascinating narratives of Mongol agency in the actual Buddhistization of Tibet and China, as I said. Zawadamden, as we might expect, was exemplary in this regard. In his The Golden Annals, it becomes clear that while he is reading out a distinct Mongolian history from Tibetan sources, we might also say that he is reading in Mongolian agents as catalysts in the well-worn stories of the Buddhist history of Tibet and China, among others. I'll quickly just mention a few of these, just by way of example. Specific to some of the very, very classic stories of Buddhism first coming to Tibet during the Tibetan imperial period, sort of the 6th to the 9th century. According to traditional Tibetan accounts, in the 5th century of Sutra, and several holy objects arrived in a casket from the sky onto the palace roof of the 28th king of Tibet. None of these texts or objects were understood by the king until the appearance of 2 strangers to his court who explained their significance and consequently established the Buddhist tradition in Tibet by way of their explanation. Zawadamden dissects this episode in the Golden Annals extensively, subjecting it to his own particular reading and elaboration. He concludes by saying, quote, from Zahor to the king's palace, a wind came and carried a text until it fell on the Tibetan palace. Bun people, which is the indigenous religion in Tibet, worship the sky. And since the text fell from the sky on top of the palace, they said it came from the gods. In reality, it was the wind from Zahor, Mongolia, not a gift from the gods. This has clearly been shown. Other early episodes in Tibet's own religious and political history reread by Zawadamden are the 7th century activities of King Somsen Gompo and his guest Padma Baba. Our author again subjects these classic Tibetan stories of Buddhistization to a decidedly late Mongol reworking in order to highlight and connect what he understands are Hor elements already present in the sources. For instance, one of Somsen Gompo's 6 inner ministers was apparently a Horpa by the name of Tamzon Zerpa Nini. He supposedly helped Songtsen Gampo develop his legal code, an important part of the foundation or the civilizing of Tibet, based on Hor and Uyghur models. Also, one of Padmasambhava's 25 disciples, first Tibetan tantric adepts, I guess we would say, is identified as a Sokpo. In relation to the founding of Samye, which is the very first monastery in Tibet, Zala Damden highlights the fact that its protector deity, Pehar, is in fact a Bata Hor king, tamed and turned into protecting the Dharma. And that the craftsmen who constructed it were largely from Hor, and that the third tier of the monastery itself was constructed in Hor fashion. Further on in the Golden Annals, Zala Damden suggests that the three saviors of the Tibetan monks order, who were fleeing from the persecution of the monastic order in Tibet at the end of the empire period, went to Hor for a period of time, making a Hor king their patron before continuing on to western Tibet under the very patronage of this Hor king. Also related to the monks' discipline, Zala Damden tracks the dissemination of the four major Vinaya texts, the monks' discipline texts, suggesting that this lineage in fact came through Hor and so en route to Tibet, and that Tibetan monastics received the Vinaya from four masters and studied it from Horpa translations. So I point this out only because the ideological weight of highlighting references to Hor and so, or Mongolia, or Mongol agents as being instrumental in the founding of the monks' order in Tibet should not be lost on us. The fact that Mongolian historians could read their own agency back into these variety of civilizing episodes from Tibet's own early history is certainly noteworthy, suggesting as it does that Mongol Buddhists understood their own religious identities as much more than passive recipients or pale imitators of Tibetan Buddhism. So to sum up this somewhat disjointed discussion or introduction, I guess, for Zala Damden, references to Hor and So in the grand story of Mongolian Buddhism were peppered across a wide swath of religious and historical sources available to him in the Tibetan language. From these, Zala Damden recovered evidence for a Mongolian Buddhist history reaching far back beyond the heights of the Mongol Empire and utterly independent of Tibet and China. It was a creative and unique reading of these Tibetan sources that produced the narratives of Mongol Buddhist history and identity, the foam of the scriptures of Sutra and Tantra. That he did this as a Mongol situated decidedly outside of Tibet, using the very stuff of Tibetan culture to construct his local and peripheral historical narratives, brings us back to the problem of identifying and understanding claims of religious and cultural difference as a part of, or in spite of, the constant circulation of Buddhist culture at this time. I think that a useful paradigm in this regard, at least as it has to do with understanding Mongolian Buddhist histories, is intertextuality. And this is so in the general sense of intertextuality as a productive kind of cultural recycling, in sharp distinction from mere imitation. It is perhaps even more applicable here in Julia Kristova's classic formulation of intertextuality as the productive reformulation of texts in local contexts, forever and active and constant redistribution. In constant redistribution. Intertextuality anticipates ever-changing and even contradictory references to authority, where ideological implications of text are manifested anew with each new reformulation and circulation. I think that such a dynamic paradigm is well suited for future research on the localization and domestication of Tibetan religious forms in Mongol lands, and certainly so for the mosaic of quotations and creative rereadings which define Mongolian Buddhist historiography. Thank you.
I would like first to thank all organizers of this event. This is the first probably on the West Coast and second panel on Mongolian Buddhism in the country that we are aware of. Like Matthew's paper, my presentation will build on something that Gurjav introduced us to, and it will be integral to the early stages of Mongolian religious and cultural self-identification. They also were instrumental in the creativity among Mongolian translators. A chronicle of the Mongols faced the task of creating a new religious vocabulary, by means of which they expanded its Sakyamai of Uyghur origin, Chokyotzer, who was well versed in Mongolian, Tibetan, and Uyghur, and who produced the first known Mongolian translation of the Sense approach, which emphasize clarity of expression and stylistic elegance. Of the translation of the Pancharakshara, Sarabsenge asserts that he compared the Uyghur version with the Sanskrit original. Likewise, in the colophon to his translation of the Golden Light Sutra, one reads that his translation was made in consultation with certain Indian scholar, Punyabhadra, who was well versed in Sanskrit and Tibetan. As further evidence by Choidioder's and Sarabsenge's translations, already in the 13th century, the common principle of translating canonical Buddhist texts from Tibetan into Mongolian was to restore Sanskrit proper names of individuals, topographical features, mountains, rivers, medicinal plants, fruits, trees, and the like. Whenever they were unable to find corresponding terms in the Mongolian language, they incorporated Sanskrit words instead of Tibetan. The custom of employing Buddhist Sanskrit terminology continued into subsequent centuries when the numerous translations from Tibetan into Mongolian were produced. And it endured until the early 20th century. By the 18th century, when the classical Mongolian language came into being and the codification of the Mongolian Buddhist lexicon began, a large number of Sanskrit words became fully assimilated into literary Mongolian. Colophons, who considerable number of texts contained in the Mongolian canonical collection of Danjur, speak of these translations as revisions of the older traditions, which are prepared through comparison of Tibetan versions with Sanskrit originals. Moreover, a certain amount of Tibetan vocabulary pertaining to monastic degrees and rituals entered the Mongolian language through process of translation, facilitating to some degree a blending of languages and cultures. Prior to the 18th century, the codification of Mongolian Buddhist terminology had not yet taken place. Thus, during the period between 1628 and 1629, when the preparation of the Mongolian kanji began under the auspices of Ridhan Khan, a homogenized Mongolian Buddhist terminology was still non-existent. The codification and standardization of Mongolian Buddhist vocabulary took place a century later when a revision of the Mongolian Danjur, which was commissioned by the Qing Emperor Xianlong, began to take shape in 1742. It's a prophetic manner and gives concise descriptions of the basic ideas in the context in which, as such, it surpasses the boundaries of a dictionary and facilitates an in-depth study of Mongolian Danjur. The authors of a source of scholars set out to accomplish two tasks: to gloss and interpret the terminology pertaining to the 5 major and 5 minor fields of Buddhist knowledge, and to explain the differences between the old and new Tibetan vocabulary. They informed us that the aim of these two tasks was to facilitate accurate Mongolian translations, whose impact can be measured in terms of the cognitive and spiritual progress of the reader. They advise the translator to employ well-known Mongolian words that move and excite the mind, the words of praise, blame, wonder, fear, and despair. When translating poetry, the translator is to select words that are poetic, meaningful, easy to follow, and that conform to the rules of alliteration in the literary Mongolian language. The translator is not to render a sentence by following the grammatical rules of the Tibetan language. However, he is to preserve the word order of Tibetan sentence whenever possible. You can already imagine what problems that caused. When a close translation results in a great excess of words that obscure the meaning of the source text, the translator is allowed to remove those words so long as this does not distort the meaning. Its authors required that untranslatable terms or the words whose rendition into Mongolian could contradict the meanings preserved in their original, then these words are to be preserved in the original and not to be translated. Alternatively, a word that has a similar meaning and is easily pronounceable can be used in the place of an untranslatable term. In accordance with this principle, the source of scholars lists multiple meanings of a single term in the sequence of its primary, secondary, tertiary meanings, and it informs the reader of the context in which these meanings occur. The translator is further cautioned that the technical term occurring in the assertions given from the same point of view within a single system of Buddhist thought carries the same meaning in all sentences. But the fact that the source of scholars abounds in exceptions and stipulations reveals the difficulties its authors encountered in attempting to produce a homogeneous theory of translation and a standardized terminology. In compiling the source of scholars, its authors relied on the 3.5 centuries long experience of Mongolian translators. This is evidenced by the fact that this text contains both the terminology used prior to the 18th century and the technical terms and personal names that were included in the Tibetan Mongolian dictionaries predating its composition. Nevertheless, the majority of the single and compounded terms contained in the source of scholars gain new Mongolian meanings. The authors of the source of scholars are concerned with scholarly integrity and motivation of the translator. For them, the translator's ability to render scriptures accurately and to benefit others is contingent not only on his scholarly credentials, but also on his pure motivation and humble attitude. In view of this, they advise the translator to bear in mind that all teachings contained in Buddhist scriptures are for the sake of nirvana and for illuminating the path of the all-knowing one. Knowing this, the translator should engage in his work thinking how wonderful it would be if these teachings permanently remain in the world. He is not to seek profit and fame through his translation, and he is to examine the meanings of words with a clear mind. For if he translates the word of the true Dharma merely for the sake of livelihood, he will inappropriately deliver the Dharma to others. Likewise, if there is something the translator doesn't know, he is to seek help from the learned, disregarding their social status. But if he does not seek help from others, out of pride or prejudice, he will inaccurately convey the teachings. But if he translates scriptures in a simple and clear manner, not contradicting their meaning, he will succeed in benefiting others. Well, further translation activity and study of various fields of Buddhist knowledge demanded the continuous production of terminological dictionaries and lexicons, among which the most celebrated is Mongolian Mahabhyutpati, which was prepared between the 17th and 18th century. And then after that, those other classes of lexicons came that you have in your handouts. So the fact that written and oral Mongolian translations of the same Buddhist canonical text were inextricably connected to the historical, social, and other contexts in which they had been produced by means that they cannot be characterized as definitive. The indefinite nature of a translated text makes it perpetually open to revisions and accentuates its status as a living entity. For a Buddhist text to remain alive within a single culture, it has continually to adjust itself to the new linguistic and social realities of the culture. Therefore, to the scholar, a translation can serve as a window through which the given social and historical realities can be observed. I still have a paragraph, but I can stop here. So as for the Mongolian translator and for his audience, the translation is not a mere compilation of literary signs, but yet another expression of a literary body of the Buddha, with spiritual likeness embodied in symbolic structures conforming to compositional rules. Once identified as a tutelary deity, or a yidam, the translated text transcends the boundaries between the words of the translators and the utterance of the Buddha. And I thank you for the patience that I still have.
In 1995 to 2002, she curated Mongolian art exhibitions in Tsukuba, Japan in 1997, New York in 2000, and Bonn, Germany in 2001, among others. She published on, and during this time she also published on Mongolian modern art. At UC Berkeley, her focus shifted to earlier periods, and her dissertation, entitled Ikkure, Nomadic Monastery of Mongolia, concentrates on Mongolian art of the 17th, 20th centuries. After she received her doctorate last year in 2010, she was a research associate at the Institute of East Asian Studies and is currently a lecturer in the History of Art Department here at the University of California, Berkeley. So whenever she's ready, welcome.
Okay, so my topic today will be about paintings in Mongolia. And the topic is voting against sacred narrative and visual prophecy. In her recent study, Qing Colonial Enterprise, Laura Hostetler has suggested that ethnographic illustrations made during the late Qing period are different kinds of maps designed to serve the main purpose of Qing expansionist policies. She argued that cartography was used to map out the territory of the empire, inclusive of non-Chinese peoples, while ethnographic pictures, including the Qing imperial illustrations of tributaries and Miao albums, were also, quote, symbolic maps of those peoples who comprised or at least recognized the Qing Empire, end quote. Visual representations executed during the late Qing period in Mongolia offer broader perspectives to look at mapping practices of the rulers. Cordell Yi has shown that a apparent parallel between maps and paintings in Chinese cartography has been a compelling issue, making the separation between the cartographic and artistic traditions difficult throughout Chinese history. While this paper notes favorably at Hostetler's and Yi's studies, it will rather aim on focusing on new functions that these picture maps, to borrow Paul Harris' terms, might have had beyond the limits of cartographic intentions for territorial identification. In the beginning of the 20th century, a Tibetan-Mongolian reincarnate ruler, the 8th Tsultem has his court artist Baltugin Sharov Officia Ahmed execute with other artists 2 large paintings with the title Daily Events. Only one of these 2 paintings survives today and shows various events and activities in one composition. Using variable perspective and bird's eye view, Sharov separately arranges numerous scenes of daily routine on the large composition. Divided by hills, each scene presents a self-contained familiar event of daily life of Mongolian nomads: chopping trees, harvesting, hunting, moving a yurt, getting married, making love, and so on and so forth. Although extensive and meticulous in detail, daily events is yet readable in an easy, continuous manner as the artist carefully organizes the composition by distributing larger vignettes with full events of cumulated figures along the 4 corners and presenting the movement of horsemen horizontally and diagonally across the picture plane. By placing a visually separated and distinctive tent with a Lama performing a service right in the center, the scenes seem as if they have been distributed around him. This central Lama is sitting in the tent conducting a ritual for a group of people in front of him. A close look shows bones scattered around, pointing to the death. All around him is movement across the hills, covering vast distances. On the same eye level, 2 potent scenes of marriage negotiators and relocating family with a camel caravan move towards each other, halting at the Lama's ritual, highlighting his centrality. The marriage is bracketed in several parts. A galloping group carrying a kidnapped bride is moving from the right end, while the actual marriage takes place in the top left, connecting 2 parts of the canvas almost diagonally. The relocating family reappears again in the bottom right, setting up a new gear, thus eloquently suggesting continuity in spatial and temporal zones in central Mongolia, the Alpha with the most characteristic events recognizable and typical of the region. The top register, thus, refers to the northern zone, known for its stands of dense woods. The western part of the country, prominent with mountain ranges and shamans, is contrasted to the east, with its rather plain and flat topographically, here distinct with agricultural activities. The southern Gobi regions are notated at the bottom with dominant figures of camels, with a large scene with felt production placed in the southwest. In other words, the artist's ambitious goal to encompass the whole halkha visually in one composition suggests that the painting was a part of the Bogdagian's mapping practices, here covertly substituting the usual cartographic techniques with ethnographic narratives. If the ruler's other maps were restricted to only his main seat Ikhure monastery and its neighborhood, this time the artist and the patron extended their vision to the countryside areas where the Bogdagian had only a limited chance to travel himself. The ethnographic picture map by Sharaf was publicly displayed and matched perfectly the Bogdagian's quest to learn about the world and extend his outreach to its subjects beyond Ikhure. Several texts mention how Bogdagian gathered artists to instruct them to go in all four directions and depict everything they see on their way. That is, to collect ethnographic knowledge about ordinary people's lives in a manner similar to the Qing production of Miao albums. In the Mongolian case, however, the other did not constitute frontier people of other ethnic origins. No other Mongol ethnic groups beyond the Halkha secular population. How then this symbolic map reflect the ruler's strategies for nation-state politics? The two east-west movements of a family relocation and the marriage converge at the central point of Lama, whose position in the middle of composition suggests that the life of movement and reproduction culminates in the Lama's ritual. Here he is invited to mourn with the family over the dead, eloquently reminding viewers of the Buddhist concept of impermanence and the illusion of life with skulls and human bones scattered in front of the ritual space. Placing the funeral scene right in the center and visually emphasizing the discourse of death is a clever artistic device to keep the image legible in mundane terms for public viewing, and also to educate ordinary viewers on the essentials of Buddhist doctrine through literal and straightforward depiction. The obvious and logical connectedness of scenes, such as marriage, couples engaged in sexual intercourse, and giving birth, which are all annexed next to each other, generates a continuous narrative that is developed through what appear to be separate scenes at first glance. These direct indices of cyclicality of birth, life, and death, followed by ideas of production and consumption, inevitably bring to mind Bhavacharya, the Buddhist will of life. Here the composition does not take the form of a circle, nor does it follow the sequential division and structure that binds the strict Buddhist concepts deployed in the conventional depiction of Bhavacharya. Thus, we do not find clearly demarcated realms of gods, demigods, hungry ghosts, or hell. It is only the realm of humans that is depicted, closely mingled with the realm of animals. However, the core Buddhist ideas of Bhavacharya, with its didactic meaning pointing to the correlation of cause and effect, are tangentially expressed in multifarious ways. Here, the human labor that aims to secure the necessary supplies for living is represented in literal terms. However, these representations also depend upon volitional conditioning, mental formation, samhara, which opens doors into all things depicted in interrelationship with other, from rituals, from building a care, and specifically to the marriage and the conception of a new life. It is surely deliberate then that the artist places the marriage scene right underneath the harvesting of corpse, thereby annexing the volitional formation with the next link of causal dependence, as the marriage is based on the consciousness of the two families involved and reconciled. The young girl, on the other hand, forcefully taken as a bride, seems to serve here as a visual metaphor for ignorance, which is usually depicted as a blind man with a stick in traditional depiction of Bhavacharya. The departure of the bride is the condition that leads visually in two directions, to the scene of entering in new gear, name and form, namarupa, in the top left, to the sensational activities of sexual intercourse and birth, all represent several links of dependent arising: contact, sensation, craving, grasping, becoming, and birth. The girl, here now burdened with children, is right into the next scene of thought making, which represents another act of creating a condition. Under newly made piece of thought, we see a new scene of couple embracing and kissing, symbolizing once again contact, sensation, and craving. The painting does not elaborate on every causality link separately. Rather, the painting presents an easily readable narrative that aims to highlight the message of cause and effect for dependence upon conditions, in reliance upon conditions, through the force of conditions, end quote, by His Holiness, showing explicitly how all culminate in the central message of impermanence, death, and the leading Lama. This type of hardships that the Bogdagan mentions in his Lunden texts point to incredible hardships of political and social turmoil, where the Bogdagan and Ikhure were the main targets. So I give a small quote from his Lunden. Bogdagan writes, "If one falls into boundless ocean, it is difficult to come out. All sentient beings, big and small, listen to Bogdagan's instructions. If you write them with all devotion and worship, it will be good. All my disciples, disseminate Bogdagan's instructions. My instructions, during this time of hardships, I am the bright light to radiate the gloomy day." The Chinese revolutionaries entered Ikhure in 1919, followed by White Russian punitive army with Baron Eugen von Sternberg, who attacked Ikhure in order to sort of liberate Mongolia from Chinese army in 1920. Amidst all these events, the daily events was not only executed but also publicly displayed with other similar paintings with secular scenes but covert meanings. The readability and familiarity of scenes is specifically chosen to construct the linked narrative in order to engage the viewer in the full dynamics of viewing, so that he or she can both comprehend and enjoy the visual narrative. If a Buddhist painting, and specifically the traditionally depicted Bhava Chakra, demonstrates a symbolically charged imagery that is impossible to follow without proper training and a teacher's guidance, this wheel of life is specifically designed to comprehensively viewed by ordinary people on their own. Sharavan Bogdagan, the artist and the patron, aimed at a different construction of the wheel of life, one that is very different from what Stephen Tyser has described non-narrative art of the traditional depicted wheel of life paintings, where the viewing experience involves discriminating between the different parts of the composition and learning their symbolic value, not following a story. Here not only does the viewer comprehensively decipher the meaning and follows a story, but he also effortlessly projects himself into the narrative of Buddhist teaching, where the Lama is the center of the ritual. In another ritual, the Lama again reappears to serve his disciples as the bright light to radiate gloomy day. The artist renders Ikhure as a gigantic mandala of Vajrabhairava with a Jetsundabar circling to secure the welfare of our entire site. The Maitreya procession, which clearly recalls Ikhure's similar Maitreya procession, the line of a river further down, and the portrait of Jetsundabar himself denote his estate on the Tula River, where the two palaces, the Green Palace and Lavram, were all built. A courtyard with Hiroka Vajrabhairava between points to the state oracle's newly built temple, completed in 1908. The depiction of the Ikhure's octagonal Lavram further corroborates a visual truth of the Vajrabhaira mandala occupying Ikhure as a mandalic space. According to this inscription, in its counterpart, the Meditations of Bogdagan, in the wooden marquee year 1884, the Bogdagan, 14 years of age, was initiated into Vajrabhairava, suggesting that the both paintings refer to him as Vajrabhairava with and without his mandala. The Bogdagan then resides in and embraces Ikhure as Vajrabhairava, while his disciples and the viewers pray to and meditate upon the deity. As the spiritual guru of the Mongols during the time of political unrest, the Bogdagan reaches out to his people through the means of ethnographic narratives, which are easy visuals for the uninitiated and which all include hatha subjects, and through the mandala of his initiated disciples. The prominent, equally monumental figure of Ushnisha Siddhartha, situated at the bottom of the mandala, is thus deliberate, reinforcing the notion of the state's protection and the nation's security. The Buddha again repeatedly states in his Lundin writings, "Bad is coming. All over the world, it is the time for accumulation of bad is to come. My fellow Mongolians, aspire for good through your faith and remove bad. From the year of rat, 1924, suffering and disaster will be even harder." The year of rat that the Buddha here indicates is the time of his own death, 1924, which is to suggest that he was predicting the upcoming destructive years that would indeed be particularly harsh after his death with the establishment of a new socialist government. In these upcoming destructive years, the Buddha again instructs his diverse subjects to rely on core essentials of Buddhist Dharma as the only salvation path. The daily events allows the viewers to follow from one scene to another, reading the events in the sequential narrative. The uncomplicated worldliness of the scenes help him or her to realize how phenomena are empty of inherent existence. Therefore, in order to reflect on the fact that things, the subject upon which a meditator reflects, are empty of inherent existence, it is necessary to identify the subject of his reflection, the phenomena that produce pleasure and pain, help and harm, and so forth. This painting, then, is not only an ethnographic mapping of the Halpa that connects and expands the ruler's outreach to the subject outside of Ikure, but also a didactic and alternative will of life that continuously engages its viewers in reading and meditating on fundamental Buddhist teachings, especially pertinent during the time of national upheaval. For the disciples and monastic community, the central Lama is precisely the ruler himself, appearing as Vajrayana, the core deity of Gelug water, who vigilantly embraces the entire site in his divine mandala space. For the uninitiated audiences, the Lama is the universal teacher and the leader who resides in the center of samsaric world, reminding the people of redemption. A historian, Francis Haskell, has argued that, quote, the early signs of impending changes in politics, morals, society, or religion are to be detected in the arts, end quote. In Haskell's analysis of Western paintings, the exceptional sensitivities of artistic genius make artworks prophetic of war and redemption, of war and revolution. In Buddha's paintings, however, it is the ruler's vision of the future and the protection of his people that seems to be visualized in support of his writings. Bad times were predicted in many Lundung prophetic writings by the future Tsundamba, but unlike him, the eighth Buddha aims at utilizing the efficacy of images to secure protection and empowerment for his people by teaching them the core essentials of Buddhist doctrines. And I would like to conclude, as the daily event demonstrates, the ruler's interest in images was not only limited to visually mapping out the territory as a resource to be dominated or controlled by a political center, as was the case according to Hostetler in 18th century Qing China. It is these images that convey the disciples' hopes and expectations to the ruler teacher for all the people's ultimate salvation. In the Buddha's own words, these images constituted the following, quote, from Buddha's Buddha. This is an offering for the prosperity of Buddhist religion, my own long life, your success, and your triumph with happiness.
90% of the population, Kazakhs, come in a second, followed by Turgut, Buryat, Arab, Ayak. For example, Darghan people are famous for their unique traditional songs, blacksmith and silversmith skills, and unique handicraft. Other ethnic groups are Zakhchin, Uranchimeg, Tormod, Darkhat, Myangat, and Tsultem, Randy Headers. Mongolia's unique culture, which reflects all ethnic diversity, needs to be preserved. Since the political and economic transition of the 1990s, the country has gone through many rapid transformations. And I would say that there are more ahead. During the 90s, Mongolia's cultural community was looking for new and different ways to preserve and sustain arts and culture in Mongolia's new political and economic environment. In this regard, to help them, the government adopted its current cultural policy by the Parliament Act on April 9, 1996. At the same time, the foundations of our cultural policy were laid down in Mongolia's concepts of foreign policy and national security. The concept of foreign policy defines that the main objective of the cultural and humanitarian foreign relations reside in protecting the culture and the way of life of Mongols, preserving the unique cultural heritage and enriching it with the achievements of world culture by restoring national historical and cultural assets, recovering cultural and art relics from abroad, in using cultural cooperation for the purpose of educating and training skilled personnel capable of working in new conditions, introducing Mongolia to foreign countries, expanding the ranks of well-wishers and supporters of Mongolia, encouraging Mongolian studies in other nations, and promoting mutual understanding and trust. Let me outline some of Mongolia's cultural heritage preservation and promotion, for which should be our primary goal. Mongolia is one of the Oriental countries with an ancient and unique culture. The Mongolian script created by Mongols is one of the 6 most recognized alphabets used in the contemporary world. Since 1990, the government of Mongolia has been focusing on restoration and preservation of the Mongolian script. Mongolian nation has a great cultural heritage of oral and written literature, which takes the form of tales, legends, verbs, wise saying, teaching, riddles, verses, poetic repertories, heroic epics, and odes. It is important to preserve and pass on oral folklore to the next generations. Mongolian traditional music comprises a wide range of instruments and uses the human voice found almost nowhere else. We are proud of our young generation of Mongolian talented artists who work to develop and promote Mongolian traditional musical legacy. With regards to museums, until the beginning of the 20th century, nomadic Mongolia didn't have any museums as such. Nowadays, all provinces have historical and natural museums of their own. Today, there are 47 museums nationwide. Beginning from 15th century, the religion, especially the Tibetan Buddhism, began to dominate the art of painting. Later, it developed into the fine art form. Since that time, Mongolian painting began developing in 2 major directions: iconography and genre painting, depicting simple life and the people around. In 1950s, many genres of fine art, carpet, and porcelain production were introduced and developed. Many Mongolian modern artworks are represented and exhibited all around the world. One of the primary goals of Mongolian foreign policy is to promote the history, culture, present development of Mongolia growth and work towards strengthening the positive image of Mongolia. In promoting cultural and humanitarian cooperation, Mongolia started practicing both government and people's diplomacy. In order to implement this policy, the government of Mongolia attached importance to enhancing and developing the Mongolian language, culture, and traditions, giving priority to training of Mongolian students in developed countries. Further, to accomplish this goal, it is important to continue to build up partnership with specialized funds of international organizations and developed countries, scholarships of public and private universities and institutes for the purpose of training students, upgrading specialists, conducting degree studies. As of today, I am pleased to note and express appreciation for the successful exposition of the Genghis Khan exhibition throughout the western part of the United States, as well as number of other cultural and art events organized during recent years in the United States by the joint efforts of both Mongolian and American organizations and individuals. I am delighted also to point out archaeological projects sponsored by the Smithsonian Institution. The government of Mongolia highly appreciates and encouraged Mongolian study centers all over the United States, namely in Bloomington, Indiana, and Dalton, Washington State, are making its valuable contribution to the development of Mongolian studies worldwide. I think that promoting active relations with international organizations, foundations, and non-governmental institutions in the field of education, culture, arts, sports, and information acceded to relevant treaties establishing and promoting direct ties between similar organizations, encouraging the exchange of scholars, teachers, creative workers, representatives of media and sportsmen, taking part in international cultural and art and sport events and organizing such measures as a country is the key to success. Based on that, we shall reinforce the place of national culture in world culture, protect and develop the best traditions and culture values and civilization of Mongolia in adequate interrelation of tradition and renovation. I strongly believe that the current conference on Mongolian art and culture will be an important milestone for charting our roadmap in the new era of an intensified cooperation between our two countries. In conclusion, on behalf of Ambassador of Mongolia, it is my extreme pleasure to pledge you full support and cooperation from the Embassy of Mongolia to all organizations in the matter of promoting Mongolian arts and culture in the United States of America. I wish to express my readiness to help to overcome any obstacles to further promoting the cultural ties between Mongolia and the United States. I am confident that this conference will contribute to building more avenues of cooperation between our academic and cultural communities. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you again for joining us. We are very much honored by your presence, and I'd like to present you a small token on behalf of all the collaborators on this program. Thank you very much.
story might, in some way, have been a Tibetan rendering of this Indian story of King Indrabhuti from Zahor receiving the tantras for the first time on earth, standing on the roof of his palace from the sky. And then you mentioned that the Mongols, the text that you were looking at, read themselves in because I was wondering if it was because Zahor, were they playing on the word or there?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the larger context is just I think gives a couple versions of the story, if I'm remembering correctly, and then decides that this particular version of the story, the one that includes the Zahor reference, is one that allows him to sort of identify the source of the text, and then also I didn't quite mention it, but elsewhere he sort of elaborates that the two mysterious strangers who come and sort of explain the text and the contents of sacred objects to the Tibetan king are themselves also Orcas, Mongols, kind of broadly conceived of Kashmiris or something. But for him, part of his continuity of, I mean, even calling Mongol identity so many centuries later. So that's sort of, I guess, the broader context, just in the text itself.
Yeah.
My question is a general public question. From the four presentations, it seemed that there was a sense of continuity, at least from the 13th and 14th century through to the present. What was the impact of the People's Republic, of the socialist years of the 20th century on both the history and the practice of Buddhism in Mongolia?
신두들도 үед яг үгээр манай 16-аас 20 дугаар зууны үед бол Монголын шашин бол тэр чигээр бүхэлдээ өөрчлөгдсөн байгаа. Тэрнээс өмнө яг үгээр 2-оос 11-р зуун түрүү үеийн дэлгэрэл, дунд үеийн дэлгэрэлд бол Монголын бурхан шашин бол нийтдээ бол ёс заншил, уншлаг, одоо энэ сүм хийдийн дотоод зохион байгуулалт, хувцас сэдвэр бол нэгийнхэн бол тэг түүж өгөөгүй гэсэн. Өндөр гигийн Занабазар яг 16-аас 20 дугаар зууны үед Монголын бүхэн шашин шинэ үеийн дэлгэрэлт хийдгээр социализмын үед ер нь бол яг тэр 21 оноос хойш 37 онд хувьсгал хаагдсан. 90 оноос хойш шашин маань дахин сэргэж байна.
So he says that the beginnings of Buddhism and the middle period, 13th to 14th centuries, is the time when the monastic education, monastic curriculum, monastic practice was not standardized. And that happened during what is called the period of Renaissance from 16th to 20th century, when especially Zanabazar being very instrumental, he was designing the monastic robes and establishing the foundation for monastic education curriculum and the practice, special focus of the practices in the temples. And that stopped in 1937 when all the destruction happened. And after a long break of Buddhist practice, in 1990, it's new revival now.
ер нь бол яг Монгол оронд бол хэдий ч одоо коммунист үед бол шашин хаагдсан боловч Монгол орн бол угийн ердөө үндэсний зон жаншил нь хөрсөн нь байгаа учраас 90 оноос хойш буцаад дэлгэрхэд бол аюу амархан байсан.